Welcome to Conversations About Grief. Here's our hosts, Steve Davis and the Reverend Ed Arneson.
Hi, welcome to Conversations About Grief. I'm Steve Davis. This is Reverend Ed Arneson. I just wanted to take a few minutes to ask some questions and have Ed answer them. First question, what do people get wrong about grieving, or when they try to grieve? What are people doing wrong? What's in your experience?
I hate to put it in terms of right or wrong. I think people, one of the things that people do is they deny it. They try to avoid the issue. And as some wag has said, denial is not only a river in Egypt. The thing about denial is that it works. For a while, it works. But then eventually reality kind of overcomes that. There's no simple way to say to people, well, don't deny, you can't do that. And so it's not about what they do right or wrong. It's about what I think happens. And this is my sense of it. What I think happens is that people's level of resources at the moment of loss is very important. Now that may sound like, I don't know what you're talking about. But let me use the experience of dealing with people who were hospice patients, who over a period of time, they were declining slightly and then they declined dramatically. And so this family has been struggling to care for Papa for 6-8 months, a year. And the last 2 or 3 months have been particularly difficult. And there is what is called anticipatory grief. You're grieving about what's about to happen. And so what happens is they get to that place and they are physically, spiritually, emotionally exhausted. And so when the event occurs, there's always this little bit of relief in a hospice patient. He or she's been suffering, and I'm glad their suffering is over, and that sets off all kind of alarms. Oh, I ought to be ashamed of myself. Well, that's just the way the human mind works sometimes. But the thing is that then that person has such limited resources to deal with the onslaught of grief, and they just try to hold it off. I worked at one point in my life with people with developmental disabilities. And one of the saddest things for me always, and I can remember multiple occasions, some person had been in a state school for a long time, and then they gotten lucky, gotten blessed, and they were moved to a community facility, and that's where I would have been involved. And then Grandpa, they didn't see Grandpa often, but Grandpa had a place in their mind, and Grandpa would die. They did not have the intellectual treasure they needed to deal with it. And they had no access. They were kept out of the events, funerals, and everything else. So the long answer to your question is, I don't think it's right or wrong. I just think people sometimes their resources are down and they have a hard time. You know, if you ever been lost, you just try a lot of other places before you find the right way. And so I think that's kind of the issue. It's that I'm overwhelmed, I'm alone, may not be alone technically, but I feel alone. And so I think that is, I just think sometimes it's hard to get started.
Yes. Next question. If you know somebody who is experiencing deep grief of personal loss, and you're in personal contact with them, what should you say? I pretty much know what not to say because I've probably said it at one point or another. Pretty much the first thing that comes like, don't say that. Okay. So what do we say?
Well, that question is asked almost more than any other question about how do I deal with people who've had big loss. The first answer is there's no right or wrong again. First thing is, I think it's always good to be honest. I am so sorry that you have had this loss, and I honestly don't know what to say. I'm here. Presence, presence, presence.
Mhm.
This is a terrible story, but it speaks to the question. Many years ago in Wichita Falls, Texas, when I was a vocational rehabilitation counselor, I was going to work one morning, and there was an accident on a busy street on the way to the hospital. The first person I saw at the accident who just gotten out of her car was a nurse who worked at the hospital, and I knew her very well. We went to the car, or went to the scene, and there were two kids in there and the driver of the car. I think it was Mama.
Mhm.
And the 12-year-old boy, I remember his age, was really hurt bad.
Mm.
And he was asking the ambulance to hurry and those sad, difficult kind of things. And later in the day, he died. I learned later his father was a medical professional himself.
Mm.
So another person that I worked with knew him,
Mhm.
and he went to see him that night and said, I stayed for quite a while. And in those days I said, well, what did you do? He said, what on earth would I say? What would I say? And said, I didn't say anything. I sat there with him. And when I thought I'd stayed too long, I'd start to get up and he'd put his hand on my arm and wouldn't say anything, but just sit back down. And so I stayed until way late at night. And I understood then what I haven't understood before is I don't have any answer for you at the moment. I care and I'm going to be here. That's the first place you start.
Okay, very good, very good. Several years ago, it's probably been about 8 or 9 years ago, I heard a life coach speaking about grieving time. She wasn't so much speaking about grief, she was talking about difficult times in life when you have a friend or a loved one that's going through a really dark time, whether it's grief, whether it's whatever it is. And she said, it's okay to say, I don't know what to say. And that was always my go-to because I don't know what to say. But that doesn't really help people beyond a certain point. And Jim Rohn, the late motivational speaker, he said, do you know why first grade desks are so small? It's so you can't still fit in them when you're past 30 years old. You're meant to progress, you're meant to educate yourself. So I realized I need to start learning more about grief, how to talk with grieving people. My best friend who has passed away in 2019, but before he passed, his biological father passed. He was adopted, but later on in his life, in his mid 40s, he was able to meet his biological father. He was working a job site in El Paso for a while, and his biological father happened to live in El Paso. He was able to spend time with his biological father, which was really good. And then his biological father died unexpectedly one day of a heart attack without any, I don't want to say notice, but without any advanced warning.
Suddenly.
Yes, suddenly. He calls me up because we used to talk all the time on the phone. And Coop, as we called him, and Coop said to me, what do I do? You lost your dad back in 05. What should I do? And when I'm sitting there saying, I don't know what to say, that only goes so far. So if somebody should happen, I know we talked about what to say, what not to say, but what to say when somebody asks, what should I do? What do I need to do?
It's interesting that people who have this experience know about other people who've had the experience. He knew immediately you had had the experience. And I would think that the most helpful thing would be to say to my friend Coop, I don't know what to tell you, but let me tell you what I did. Let me tell you how it was for me. And this is how I got through it. I'm not trying to say to you that's what you ought to do or that's the best way. I'm just saying that's how I got to where I am today. And I think that's what you do.
Okay, very good, very good. Yes, yes. And that I had more or less said something similar about this is what I did, this is what I did that didn't help, this is what I did that made it worse, this is what I kind of did that, if anything, because I'd compartmentalized so much when it happened and it had been so long ago. Coop had lost his father in, I think it was 2017. So it was 12 years after my dad had passed. So I'd had a few more experiences, a few more things that I kind of knew just a little bit more. And I was like, well, you don't want to do this, but try to do this.
Well, I think one of the things that's important again is you don't know what effect some of that had. So I wouldn't judge myself on the basis of what I said that was wrong. We've all made mistakes, and I certainly have, or what was right or whatever. And I think that we have to be very careful that we're not saying to the person you're grieving and let me tell you how to do it.
Mhm.
That won't work. That's not even
Right.
remotely possible or even remotely effective. What we're saying is, number one, always, I care that you're grieving. I may have some similar experiences, not exactly like yours. I care, and I'm going to be here to be to support you in any way I can. And perhaps that support would mean I have some experience that would benefit you as you move along.
Mhm.
But we're not here. You just can't walk and say, I've got all the answers.
No, no.
Ministers get now, they didn't in the days past, they
Mhm.
get quite a bit of training if they're seminary trained about grief and about counseling. And it used to be, and a young minister is uncomfortable and he may walk in and say, well, I know you're grieving. And so this is what you need to 1, 2, 3. Well, he's already closed the door. You got to wait until the door opens if you're going to have an opportunity to say,
Mhm.
this is what happened and this is what I think might, and this is an experience I've had. So humility and gentleness
Mhm.
and concern, kindness and love always will get you further than any sense of I've got, and I know you're not saying that, but any sense that I know how to fix this.
Right, right.
Yeah, grief can't just be fixed.
Yes. No,
Grief
it
is
cannot. No, it's, yeah. It's interesting. Now, you mentioned a book in our first episode, Good Grief. I got that book on my Kindle. I'm about 65% through it right now. That book was written, was it in 1965,
Yeah.
around there?
Yeah.
This is just a personal question of mine because the author of the book did such a good job. He wrote the book and it's explained a lot. It's a very short, it's not a long read. It's very practical. There's no fluff in the book. It's just straight, yeah, good information. What my question is, he wrote the book around 65. What did people do before then as far as grief? Because I know our culture has changed so much. It's changed so much. To give you an idea, my oldest child is 27. My youngest child is 12. That's 15-year difference. It might as well be a 150-year difference with the difference in parenting and everything like that. So, what was grief like before?
Well, Granger Westberg wrote that book, and it has kind of long since been out of vogue in the academic community because it was too simple and it was too plain and it was all of those things. One of the testimonies for the book is you don't find many books like that still in print 60 years after it first started. There's
Mhm.
not many of them. And a
Yes.
few years ago, I don't know whether it's the same, a few years ago, when I was involved in ordering those books a lot for clients, for patients' families, the book still sold over 1 million copies a year.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
so what happened before that is no one had ever studied grief as a process. A man named, I believe I've got this right, I should have looked it up, but I didn't. So forgive me if I'm wrong. Eric Lindemann, I believe, studied the effects among a large group of people after a catastrophic fire, I believe in New York at a nightclub. There was a fire, a lot of people were lost their lives, and he followed those people. So that would have been, I think, in the late 50s. That was the beginning of people starting to know about grief. I think the thing that Granger did more than anything else is he made an offer to people to understand that grief had a process to it, that there were parts of it that were recognizable. And that's what we've been saying. What I've been saying is there is this great sense, you can't help me with my grief. You can't talk to me about my grief because it's entirely mine. The part of it that's entirely the individual's is the loss, the meaning, the relationship. That is, no one knows about that. I don't know what your relationship to your father was. If I had known both of you well, I would not have known the depth of that relationship. So Granger kind of opened up the whole process. And as I also said, there's another book by William Worden. And William Worden's book is probably the one academically and therapeutically that is most accepted. And he talks about 4 tasks that are required. And that first you have to come to the realization the person is really gone. My neighbor the other day said, I'm having a difficult time with that. And so then the next thing is you have to work through to the pain of grief. And that's, you have to get to that. And then you try to find a place to relocate the one that's gone in your life. Meaning if it's whoever, your father doesn't just go away, but somehow you relocate it and then you reestablish your own life. And so those are parts to the process, I think.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Yeah, because before then you just never saw anything. I mean, there's nothing, even when you look at older movies or read older books back then, it was just an accepted part of life because the mortality rate back, especially back before we became more modernized, the mortality rate was much, much lower. So you just expected death as an everyday aspect, whether or not, but yes.
I think that people have always grieved about the loss of loved ones. I always think about David in the Old Testament when his son, who was basically a scoundrel, Absalom, was killed, and he just went, oh, Absalom, Absalom, my son, I wish it were me and not you. Every parent who's ever lost a child has said that. Every parent probably has. So we're in deep water. We're in the water of trying to help people. And the point, what is the point? The point is that grieving is really difficult. Grieving alone is more difficult. Being able to get involved in a process that helps you is difficult. The results can be satisfying, I guess.
Okay. That's going to conclude this episode today. Thank you for joining us at Conversations About Grief. If you have any questions you would like us to answer, conversationsaboutgrief@gmail.com. Email them to us. We'll be happy to answer your questions. See you next episode.
Bye.
Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say. Say what you need to say.
Thank you for listening today. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions about grief, please email us at Conversationsaboutgrief@gmail.com.